J.R.R. Tolkien was one of the greatest writers of the 20th century. He wrote books like The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings. In fact, I think it's easy to say that his influence has not lessened over the years, but rather has strengthened and grown. Here's his whole life in 5 minutes. Tolkien's parents moved from England to South Africa. 1 year later, in 1892, they welcomed John Ronald Reuel Tolkien into the world. But the climate was hard on Tolkien's body, and when he was 3 years old, his mother took him and his brother back to England. His father, though, got sick and died before he could join them. They lived with his mother's family for about a year and then moved into the English countryside. This place was called Sarehole. Tolkien lived there from about 4 years old to 8 years old. The experiences he had in Sarehole deeply impacted his life. 4 years, but the longest seeming and most formative part of my life. In Sarehole, his mother started teaching him Latin, where he learned a love of languages. His mother gave him books, such as the Red Fairy book by Andrew Lang. His mother became Catholic. He started having a dream about Atlantis that recurred throughout his life, and he developed an unusual love for trees. So all of that happened in Sarehole. When he was 8 years old, they moved into Birmingham so Tolkien could attend King Edward's School. But the fees were too high for a single mother, so when Tolkien was 10 years old, he moved into St. Philip's, which was much cheaper, but the education was also lower quality. But Tolkien was also a very gifted student. When he was 11 years old, he got a scholarship and moved back to King Edward's School. At 12 years old, something happened to Tolkien that was very devastating. His mother died. This left both Tolkien and his brother as orphans. In her will, she had appointed a Catholic priest named Father Francis to take care of them. Tolkien excelled at King Edward's. He continued studying languages such as Latin, Greek, French, German, Old English, Old Norse, and Gothic. He was inspired by the Gothic language and started inventing his own languages. Tolkien and his brother had been living with an aunt, but when Tolkien was 16 years old, Father Francis moved them into a different house. This house was owned by a woman who would rent out her extra bedrooms. Tolkien and his brother lived in one bedroom, and in another lived a girl named Edith. She was 3 years older than Tolkien, and like the two brothers, she was also an orphan. Tolkien and Edith developed a close friendship, which turned into a romance. However, Father Francis strongly objected. First of all, Edith was 3 years older than Tolkien, she wasn't Catholic, and they were living in the same house together. Father Francis demanded that Tolkien cease the romance and forbade any communication between them. Tolkien obeyed, and Edith, feeling social pressure, moved somewhere else. Tolkien continued excelling at King Edward's School. At 19 years old, Tolkien transferred to Oxford University, where he earned a scholarship studying English language and literature. A few years later, at midnight on January 3rd, 1913, Tolkien turned 21, and Father Francis no longer had any legal authority over him. Within the hour, Tolkien wrote a letter to Edith asking her to marry him. She agreed. He also asked her to become Catholic, and she agreed to that as well. At 23, Tolkien graduated from Oxford with first-class honors. At 24, he and Edith were married. It was a beautiful spring day in March of 1916. But a few months later, Tolkien experienced something very dark and disastrous. He went to war. Britain was fighting in World War I, and Tolkien was sent to fight in the brutal trenches of France. He later wrote, "Parting from my wife then, it was like death." He was stationed in Buzencourt and participated in the Battle of the Somme. However, soon afterward, he got sick with trench fever and was sent back to England. His military service in France lasted only 4 months. It was during this time in the hospital that Tolkien started working on the mythology of Middle-earth. Tolkien recovered and started working in the military in non-combative ways. In 1920, at 28 years old, Tolkien was finally discharged from the military and employed by the University of Leeds. In 1925, when he was 33 years old, Tolkien became a professor at Oxford University. And that's where he stayed for the rest of his life, living around Oxford, writing, raising his children, teaching, all those sorts of things. He became friends with C.S. Lewis, who was also an Oxford professor. He joined the Inklings, a group of writers who met at the Eagle and Child. There they read each other what they were working on and offered critique. During his time at Oxford, he wrote 2 books that made him famous: The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings. He spent 34 years teaching at Oxford, and then he retired. His wife died in 1971, and Tolkien finally died in 1973 at the age of 81. Tolkien and his wife deeply loved each other throughout their whole lives. Tolkien even wrote their romance into the history of Middle-earth. It's a tale called Beren and Luthien. It was Tolkien's favorite story of Middle-earth. Tolkien and his wife were buried at Oxford, and Tolkien had arranged for 2 names to be written on their tombstone: Beren and Luthien.